I'm so happy to be here today, but I'm also just happy to be here in front of actual human beings and chatting with folks in real life, sharing the energy of this great conference. Does anybody know where this place is? I have to admit, all I know is that it's somewhere in your beautiful country, and I was curious if anyone here actually knew the name of this place. Shout it out if you do. Does it look familiar? Okay, it's a mystery. The mystery remains unsolved. Afterwards, maybe you can tell me where this is. So it looks somewhat similar to me. So this past Sunday, my generous hosts took me to a beautiful area in the Trossachs, and we climbed up Ben An. Anybody ever been to the top of Ben An? Let me know if you've been to the top of Ben An before. All right. Now, be honest with me. Were your legs incredibly sore for literally 4 days after? Okay. I'm lucky that I'm walking out here and not sitting in that chair right now, heaving to this point. It was a beautiful hike. It was lovely. It was gorgeous. Loved it. Unseasonably warm weather, I was told. Also unseasonably windless, which was nice. I can take that. Beautiful hike up, beautiful hike down. My legs didn't mind it then so much as they do now, but look at this view from the top. Just incredible. I mean, you can see the just glories of your... so I'm told this is like the baby highlands, the little highlands, something like this. Anyway, it was high enough for me, that's for sure, and I loved it. It was beautiful and gorgeous. When we were there, we rewarded ourselves with a classic Scottish mountaineering delicacy. Anybody aware of what this is? Mac and cheese pie. We all had one of those. It was great. And I was struck by the beauty, of course, but I'm struck by the contrasting beauties of Scotland. So there's the rocks, and there's the severity and the starkness and the hardness and the coolness. But there's also the gentleness and the delicacy and just the raw beauty of the flowers. So rocks and flowers to me is the land of Scotland. The last time I was here was the year 2018. It was this conference, maybe my favorite conference. I love this conference. 2018, 4 years ago. And here I am back, 2022. Anything interesting happen between now and then? So the fact that I'm even here is a testament to Esri UK and the people of Scotland's ability to forgive. And I say that because 4 years ago, I stood on this very stage and proudly announced to everyone my Scottish credentials that I was 50% Scotch. And I knew it was wrong the second it came out of my mouth, but I couldn't take it back. And a groan rolled like a wave all the way to the back. And I'm sure, I can't see you now and I couldn't see you then, but plenty of people were checking their watches, I know. So if that wasn't bad enough, it was also a filthy lie, because I'm only 39% Scottish. It's been verified in the years since. And I thought this was kind of interesting because it was able to hone in precisely on that Scottish aspect. So do I have any cousins, distant cousins, who are joining us today from these areas? Let me hear you if I have any cousins in this area. I'm not even going to try to pronounce them. But anyways, look at these two people. Are you curious about which half of this equation donated those Scottish genes? Well, here is Chris Campbell with some relatives in Glasgow in the past. So I was born and raised in Michigan, in the glacially scraped flat tundra of Michigan, specifically Mount Pleasant. I was born and raised right here. The house is no longer there, but this is the perspective that I grew up looking at. This is the mountainous terrain in which I was raised. So you can imagine how somebody would crave geographic relief and some creative expressions of a sense of place. And I get to do that with Esri. And I work on the Living Atlas team. I've heard a lot about Living Atlas today, and it makes me very happy. It's a fantastic team, and I enjoy it very much. I design the user experience for some of our apps, and it's a great privilege to do that. And when I'm not doing that, I'm playing with the actual data. So I actually get to play with this stuff and say, hey, look, this is available, and you can use it too, and you can make maps. And invariably, If I've made a map, I want to show everyone else how I've made that map, because I can't keep that to myself. That's the best part, is showing people how I did something. Making a map is great, but showing people how to make a map is even better. And it's so rewarding and a lot of fun, and I'm glad to speak with you here about this very sort of thing. Also, I happen to be quite lazy, and when I write those blog posts, there's a lot of writing involved, there's a lot of screen captures and captions, and I thought, wouldn't it be easier if I could just record this process? And so, instead, and not instead, but in addition to, I do these videos, and I put them on YouTube, and people can watch them, and they can follow along if they like, or they can just watch for the awkwardness and enjoy it in a devious sort of way. And when I'm not doing all those sorts of things, I'm in general just loving life, wrangling these amazing human beings. And I want to talk to you about rocks and flowers. But first I want to talk about Bob Ross, obviously. Is anyone familiar with Bob Ross? The work and the legacy of such a wonderful human being. That was good to hear. I'm relieved. I love it. So I grew up watching Bob Ross and learning from Bob Ross. And his amazing energy and his gentleness and his smoothness and his technique. And he was just so fun to watch. Did I always go grab a bucket of paint and paint along with Bob? No, but he did encourage me to actually paint and draw. And he kind of tempted me into this amazing world of creativity. And I owe a lot to Bob. Probably more so than any other person, he's influenced the maps that I make and the style that I bring to that cartographic process. And I owe that to Bob. Tonal contrast and adding layers of transparency, color gradients. That's all from Bob Ross, really. He planted that seed. And he had no idea that he was doing that, right? He didn't know he was influencing a little kid who's kind of awkward and likes painting by himself in the flatlands of Michigan. He had no idea, but he was doing those things. But he's also teaching me something a little bit less tangible. He was encouraging me to try something. He was telling me it's okay to keep trying and failing and failing and failing and then keep trying again. And I thought that was wonderful because I failed plenty. And he also had bizarre hair that stood out, just like this. And so did I, because I took a medication for my asthma that made my hair stand straight out like a white dandelion. And I was horribly embarrassed by that. And for reference, by the way, this is me on a very good hair day after a lot of combing and hairspray. And I think about Bob Ross pretty frequently. Now, he had no idea what he was doing for me, but he helped me. And I wonder if you can think of someone who's done that for you. It doesn't have to be somebody on PBS, which is maybe the equivalent of BBC4 in the United States, so educational. Bob was an educator, but we're all here not totally of our own accord. We're here because we're standing on a pyramid of people who have supported us and loved us and invested in us and shown us grace when we didn't necessarily deserve it, and gave us the gift of their time and expertise and guidance. And I think that's wonderful. And so I would like for everyone to do is think of a name of somebody who's done that for them. I got that name? Okay. In 3 seconds, I want you to say it out loud. Now, don't be embarrassed because everybody next to you is going to be saying a name too, and they're not even going to hear what you're going to say, okay? So on 3, say that name. 1, 2, 3. All right, high five. I didn't expect that. But isn't that a good sound? Just that murmur of acknowledging love and support that you've received over the years. That's what it's all about, right? And that's a big part of why we're here. But another part of why I'm here is because I want to talk about rocks and flowers. But first, I think I want to show you how to isolate some layers from a vector-based map. Have you ever been using one of these amazing, freely available vector-based maps? You search, I want this, I want that, and it's just not quite right. I wish it didn't have this layer, or I wish I could just cut out the oceans and use just those in my own vector-based map. No, just me? Well, I have definitely wondered that. And so I'm going to show you how to do just that. Isolate a layer and use just that in a vector-based map. So the way I find this tool is I Google it every time. I can never actually find the URL. Esri's vector tile style editor. And this is how I get there. I could bookmark it, but I'm not that clever. I Google it every time. Here we are. We fire it up. And in this case, since I just want ocean, bathymetry, and lake and marine stuff, I'm going to pick the most basic vector base map possible to start with that I can find. And I'll add this to my editor. And then, instead of recoloring everything, I can just, let's zoom in to Scotland. I'm going to edit the JSON. Every one of these items is a layer and a set of style rules and visibility rules for it. So I can find everything that's not marine or lake or water and smite it, leaving only the marine elements. And do you see how much stuff is in this base? This is a really basic base map. These base maps are just jam-packed with layers typically. This is a pretty lean one. So I'll select everything, get rid of it, and let's see what we get. Oh, shoot. Okay. Not atypical in my world, and this is why I'm not a developer, because I don't recognize the fact that commas need to be there or don't need to be there, and good grief. Okay, all I had to do was delete that comma. I'm okay. So I'll get rid of this. Now let's try it again, and here we go. It's transparent. I'm looking at only water for the whole world. And now I've isolated this. I can just save this and use it in whatever base map I want. I didn't need everything else. Just give me the water, and I'm good to go. Now I'm glad you like this, because this took a lot of work to make this GIF culturally appropriate, because originally it was flipped around, and that wouldn't make any sense to you, and I had to have the driver on the correct side. You're welcome. I'm looking out for you. But seriously, rocks and flowers, eventually. We've made a base map, but now let's put some data on top of that base map, okay? So here we are in the map viewer, and I'm going to add that layer that I've just isolated from the vector tile style editor. And I'll just add this. And by the way, I've added this to Living Atlas if you want just the oceans and water, because why not? If it's useful for me, maybe it's useful for everybody. So you can see that I've got just marine content here, and I've moved it down into my base map as proof. And now I'm just going to get rid of my original base map content. I only want the water, right? That's all I want. And there's a really cool thing called effects. Anybody play with effects? One of my favorite effects in the map viewer is the bloom tool. It's there to make things glow, like Firefly. But when I was playing with it one day, I looked at this. The deuce? What is going on here? It's kind of glowing, but it's inverted, and the color is going outside of the area of water. And I thought it was really kind of lovely and interesting. And it gave me an idea. I didn't do it on purpose, but it gave me an evil idea. I thought, you know what? This kind of looks like... Here's a watercolor that I made for my lovely Grandma Lillian many years ago. And if you look at watercolor, you notice how the ink kind of piles up at the perimeter of your water. The pigments build up there because they're drawn to the edge. It looked like this. It kind of reminded me of a watercolor map. And as you know, I do enjoy making maps that look tactile and tangible, like you can reach out and touch them, feel them, made out of watercolor. This was one I made for the previous conference. And I do it by just taking a picture of stuff and then cropping out a little interesting bit of wrinkle and then filling it into a big global background, and I tile it up and I upload it and I nominate it to Living Atlas. By the way, if you're interested in any of these textures, they're available in Living Atlas. If you search for paper texture, you'll be able to find all kinds of weird, devious textures that I've made out there, and you drop them on your map and interesting things happen. For example, we've got a kind of watercolor-like thing, but watercolor has to exist on paper, so I'm going to search for paper texture in Living Atlas. And I'll choose the watercolor and parchment to darken it a little bit. And I'll choose that parchment one, and I'll give it a blend mode of color burn, because that'll kind of bake the tones in and make it look good. Anybody a little bit intimidated by blend modes here? Ever used blend modes? Good grief. I'm intimidated by them, but the way I get over that is by literally trying every blend mode until I find the one that looks best, or I don't use it. If it doesn't add anything, I just don't use a blend mode. I don't know what they do until I click it and see it. That's okay. I've got time. I'll just click them. So here we have something that looks plausibly watercolor-like on some paper. And as Bob tells us, we don't make mistakes. We just make happy accidents. I wasn't setting out to make a watercolor map when I did this, but I had a hunch and I followed up on it. So here you are. And the cool thing about this is, instead of a painting that you're stuck with an extent and a scale, I can zoom in, I can zoom out, and because it's fetching in that living data from an existing vector base map, I can zoom and pan wherever I want. And I'm going to add another effect, because I don't want blue land. Naturally, land has to be green, right? So I'll just change the hue using an effect, and I've made it green. I want it to be a little bit brighter and bolder, so I'll give it some contrast and darkness. And now it looks like a little bit more, it's got some more pigment involved, right? A little bit more artistic. Play with those effects, see if it works. If it doesn't work, don't use it. But pulling and pushing knobs and sliders is easy, so go for it. So here we are. I'm going to add another layer. And this time, I'm going to search for bathymetry light. Once again, I'm adding the same layer in twice. Why would I do that? Because I actually want to show the water areas as colored this time. So this is just the same layer added a second time, and I'm going to name them so I can keep track of what's going on. You can see what we've got. Now we've got something kind of water-like. And I can change the brightness and contrast to my taste. And now it's time for some context. I don't know where these things are, so I want to add a reference layer from a vector-based map. If you look up reference, it gives you options for just overlay content. And do you see how I'm dragging that up into the reference layers? That's so that the labels will always render on top of the data. I don't have data covering up my labels and I have to make my data semi-transparent. I can just add that label layer as a reference. And let's play with bloom again, because why not? And hey, this is kind of interesting. What is going on, right? I look like I've ruined it, but it gives me another wonderful, awful idea. This kind of looks like the paint is bunched up close to the labels, and I'm avoiding the labels with my paintbrush, but as a result, the pigment kind of packs in around the perimeter of where the text would be. I think I can use this. It looks neat, so I'm just going to keep it. I didn't do it on purpose. It was an accident, but I like it. It's a happy accident. And now I can just add in another label layer, because why not? I still want to actually read these things. And I'll give them a multiply blend mode, so I'm only seeing the darkness of the text instead of the casing around them. And I'll push them back a little bit, transparency-wise. So now I've got some text, and it looks like I painted around them, because I didn't want to cover up the labels with my paint. Again, I can zoom in and out. Isn't that great? Look at the Firth of Forth there. Okay, here are some examples. Taking a tour of Scotland. We've painted it. We did it with watercolor, but really we did it with pixels and a little bit of evil ingenuity. And it's a lot of fun. I think you should give it a try. And if having fun is a motivator, believe me, you'll get better and better at what you do by having fun. Play is a tool. I actually want to get to rocks and flowers, I swear. Just after we put some data on top of the base map that we've just made. So, a base map is a lot like this platter, right? But what good is a platter if you don't stick something on it? So here's a biscuit. Let's add a biscuit to our map. This is vector magnitude and direction data, which actually is, confusingly, a raster image service, and it renders by default as a vector field of arrows. This data happens to be storm bara. And you can see the magnitude of the wind and the direction of the wind. Does anybody remember storm bara last year? I don't remember it, but I'm told you might remember it. So here's storm bara. But it doesn't have to look like this by default. I can give it a flow render. And with this data format, the map viewer is happy to make it look like little moving sprites. And something like this gives me a much different, I would argue, better picture of wind movement and direction and magnitude. Look at those patterns that happen. Storm bara, the flow renderer. this is a lot of data. And sometimes we have so much data that it actually covers up the context of the base map. And while I like a lot of biscuits, sometimes it's a little bit too much. So it gives me an idea once more. When I look at painting, and when I paint with watercolor, sometimes I'll blow the water in different directions. And the paint will be controlled in that way, or I'll tilt it and shake it a little bit. And I thought, maybe I can do something weird with this data like I do with paint. And so, instead of just rendering it on top, I thought, well, why don't I give this like a basic gray color. I'll really crank up the speed because that's interesting. I'll make it dense because, let's make it dense, more is better. And I'll make them a lot wider so they cover a little bit more area on the map. And now I'll go to the effects. I'll make it a little bit blurry and fuzzy instead of perfectly crisp and vectory. And then I'll give it a blend mode of destination at top. Destination at top is like a cookie cutter. Now we're only revealing the base map based on where the wind patterns flow, right? So the wind itself is illuminating the base map. The context that we have comes from the data that sits on top of it. We're not covering it up, we're doing the opposite, we're revealing it. But I've kind of lost that texture of the paper, and I miss that a little bit. So I can just add in more paper. Once again, I'll look for paper texture from Living Atlas, and I can drop in a watercolor layer and a parchment layer and give that parchment a color burn so it looks like the base map did. And now I've got something that looks like I'm blowing watercolor paint around on an honest-to-goodness little slab of watercolor paper. And the paint itself is the data. Now, why would I want to do something like this? Because it's fun and it's interesting and I can do it. Is this the best way to show storm bar data? Not necessarily, but everybody brings their own dimension and their own energy to mapping. I mean, I could have used it to cookie cutter out the underlying imagery instead of our watercolor base map, which has a neat effect as well. Or I could have just color-coded it and left it rendering on top of the imagery. And I lose a little bit of the context, but still, it's got a powerful visual appeal to it. Because if we all did it the same way, it would be a little bit boring. And you have to have brightness on a dark background if you want to show, if you want your content to be really highly visual. And if you have a light background, you have dark contrast, or high contrast on top. So contrast drives meaning. Light base map, dark data. Dark base map, light data. Now, I think of data visualization quite a bit while I'm picking raspberries. Do you have raspberries near where you live? Okay. We've got a great raspberry patch in our garden. It's just so fun. We get 2 crops a year, once in the early summer and once in the fall. Right now they're doing the last of their blooming. And it's a thing of luxury to fill oneself on raspberries, am I right? It's such it's decadent. And when I pick raspberries, I stay in one spot and I grab everything that I can see. And when it's gone, I find all I have to do is take a step over, and immediately more raspberries are available to me. There's nothing wrong with the first bit of raspberries, and there's nothing wrong with the other bit of raspberries. By changing my perspective, I'm just getting more raspberries, right? What am I even talking about? Rocks and flowers, right? I'm deviating. Okay, back to the topic. So, my first official full-time job out of university was in a small island in the Atlantic Ocean, and believe me, a full-time job was very welcome. It came none too soon, and it was with a lovely Native American tribe there, and I was the GIS technician. And I would find things to stay busy with. And one day, I was out in the woods, and it was my job to, that day, capture the GPS locations of their historic village. And I'm thinking, okay, historic abandoned village. I'm looking for old houses, decrepit old derelict things, and I'll just go GPS it. And I got to the location marked for me, and it was empty. It was a dense forest with a lot of undergrowth, and there was nothing there. And I stood there for a long time wondering, did I get this wrong? And I would notice, however, there were little square depressions in the ground. And I thought, oh my goodness. And each one was surrounded by a loosely cobbled ring of stone that had fallen in. These were the old foundations for these small homes that once lived here a few hundred years ago. And in the time since then, they had just kind of crumbled in, fallen into ruin, and the homes that they supported themselves had long since disappeared. And when I took a step back, I noticed something else. I noticed little yellow flowers, and these happened to be daffodil flowers, and they were in non-random patterns. And geographers know that anytime you see something non-random, you have to ask yourself, what's driving this pattern? These patterns were geometric, neat rows of flowers around long since crumbled stone foundations. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness. So the crafters of these homes did the hard work and important work of building the foundation for the houses that they lived in. But they also took the time to make something lovely and make the environment that they lived in beautiful and charming. And while the stones had kind of crumbled and faded away, those flowers were still there, dutifully blooming where they were planted these hundreds of years later, which is remarkable, right? The energy that those people put into making their world better lives on all those years later, whereas the hard work was important and necessary, but things have progressed, and the world is sort of done with those things. And that's the whole point of a conference, right? We're here to learn about hard work, new technology, cutting-edge things. We can do our jobs. We can change the world and make it better. It's important that we're doing this. But it's also important to remember that we're making relationships, we're investing in each other, and we're making friendships, and we're supporting each other, and we're making this world a little bit more beautiful and vibrant and bright and lovely. And so, I'd like you to think of another name, this time somebody for whom you can be a mentor, somebody that you can invest time in, somebody that you can show grace to, and somebody that you can guide and direct. Okay? Are you thinking of somebody? But I don't want you to say it out loud. Just keep it to yourself. And think about them. And maybe someday in the future, those people will say your name when some stooge from Michigan asks them to give a name of somebody who is influential for them. So, this conference, while we're doing the hard work, remember the yard work. But then I realized this doesn't quite work with you, because you would say garden, and I've blown it. So, back to the drawing board, new rhyme. While doing what we're paid for, remember what we're made for, right? And that's where the real enduring reward is, okay? Thank you very much. And if you'd like to download this poster in a digital format, it's available at the destination of this code.